Righty. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Miles. I'm the Outreach and Communications Manager for the AEDE department. And again, thank you all for coming. I'll just start us off by saying um, all of you will be muted throughout the event and cameras off. And we will have a quick Q&A after the um, presentation. I think that's kind of all I'll say, and I will hand it over to Dr. Ian Sheldon to introduce Dr. Yao Wang. Thank you.
Thanks, Miles, and welcome everybody to today's webinar sponsored by our Department of Agricultural, Environmental and Development Economics. My name is Ian Sheldon. I hold the Anderson's Chair in the department, and it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker for today. Yao Wang is an assistant professor in the department, and she's going to be talking about basically Intel and I'm assuming what it might mean for that company coming here to New Albany here in Central Ohio. Just a reminder to participants following up on what Miles said, you will be muted with cameras off throughout the webinar. But if you'd like to ask a question at any point during the seminar, we'll save those up for the end. If you would put those in the Q&A box, and I will monitor those and ask them on your behalf to Yao as we get to the end of the webinar. So Yao, welcome once again. We look forward to hearing what you have to say about place-based economic development, the case of Intel. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ian. Hello, everyone. So my name is Yao Wang. So I'm an assistant professor at ADE. So my general research interest lies at the intersection of urban economics and development economics. So I'm really interested in understanding the intended and unintended consequences of different place-based policies. And actually, the case of Intel entry to Central Ohio offered me a great chance to actually apply my knowledge on this area and understand what would happen to Ohio. Right now I'm talking about some knowledge I know about this area, but it's really hard for me to predict what would happen to our Ohio district. Obviously, Intel just announced that the whole project is the construction of the whole project is delayed again. So it probably would take us even longer to understand what exactly would happen. So let me get started. So today I will talk about the place-based policy, place-based economic development, understanding the case of Intel. So Intel back in 2022 announced that it would be building its most advanced semiconductor manufacturing facility in Ohio. So this brings exciting news for people because some people believe it's going to be a transformative move to Ohio's economy because it will, as Intel promised, it's going to bring about 3,000 new high-tech Intel jobs, along with about tens of thousands of indirect and supporting jobs by contractors, suppliers, and this would rejuvenate the Ohio economy a lot. Along with these job opportunities provided by Intel, we also see a lot of moves or support from the public sectors. Actually, the Ohio Department of Transportation has announced about $90 million for building infrastructures and investing, improving infrastructures to support the construction of Intel and the nearby sites. This include, so most of the funds would happen in constructing and protecting, maintaining the local roadways in Delaware, Franklin, and Lincoln counties. Besides that, we also see many changes. Many Intel suppliers and supporting companies have already started announcing plans to join Intel in New Albany. So this is like a layout of the New Albany International Business Park. As we can see, as a center of the park, we have Intel, but we also have many other high-tech or supplier firms plan to joining the whole grand project. And of course, this attracts a lot of investment in the public sector again. So the Ohio Department of Development has created this Silicon Heartland Supply Consortium to help help the current and prospective Ohio suppliers to compete for new federal fundings for semiconductor materials and equipment. In total, today we are talking about the entry of Intel, but actually is much more than that. This is actually a more ambitious efforts by the Ohio government that actually it's a combination of the Intel entry and a large investment from the public sector to support attracting business. So the eventual goal is trying to enhance and promote economic performance of Ohio. So this makes our topic today lies at the bigger umbrella of topic that is place-based policies. So place-based policies refers to government efforts to enhance the economic performances of a certain location. So instead of targeting at certain firms or people or households, they actually provide subsidies and incentives for certain locations. And this place-based policy has been widely used throughout the US history and has been widely used not only outside the US, including Europe and many developing countries too. So there are a lot of rationales for government to conduct such policies or design such policies. First of all, the most direct rationale for that is this create opportunities for business and potentially attracts firms. And along with that, it would also create job opportunities for local residents and migrants. And another very important rationale for such place-based policies lies at the core of the idea of agglomeration, which is also a core concept for urban economics. So agglomeration economics refers to the phenomenon that locations that are denser in jobs and people are more efficient and productive. It is perhaps because this offers opportunities to learn from other people. So this learning shared among people, which we usually call knowledge spillover. Or it could also mean this create better matches between workers and firms, because as more people and jobs and firms clustered in a certain location, simply the labor pool and firm pool is larger. Besides that, a lot of policymakers have high faith in place-based policies. Lies at the face that they believe that as more and more people get jobs and as more and more firms increase their profits, this would enlarge the tax base, therefore create more tax revenues, and which can be used to provide and construct better infrastructures. And with this infrastructure, this would further attract firms and people and form this virtuous cycle of local development. Besides the hope for agglomeration economies, a lot of place-based policies, a lot of arguments for that is out of the concern for distributional purposes. So there are a lot of policymakers hope that even though we have to create jobs in the poor urban areas and sacrifice sacrifice certain locations because it probably entails lower jobs in those locations, but they still want to do it because they want to help those underdeveloped areas and to promote a more equitable development scheme. However, place-based policies also brings a lot of caveats. Sometimes those policies, even with great hope from the policymakers, does not turn out as well. So the first caveat related to it is that even though the government or the public sector spend a lot of money on promoting business in a certain location, would that really attract firms? So I have currently I have a research looking at in a different context, looking at how tax reductions provided by Indonesian governments in certain locations attracts firms. And we find out even though the firms have to pay like about half less taxes for capital in those locations, they don't want to move to those locations. So ultimately, firms want to create, the ultimate goals for firms is to create profits. So no matter how much incentives government provides, their goal is still trying to maximize profits. So there is no definite outcome or consequence of such policies to promote firms location, promote attracts firms, because incentives is not the only motive for firms to choose locations. And besides that, even though a lot of opportunities are created by the relocation of firms, by the government incentives, are those job opportunities equally shared by people? And if not, who actually gets the job? This is a very important question, especially for policymakers who care about certain, for example, more vulnerable populations. We will discuss this more, and actually this really depends on the migration pattern and the population structure of the locations. Besides that, even though the place-based policy attracts business and jobs and create job opportunities, does that really promote agglomeration? Does this really promote a big push to the local economies? This really depends on the local, the natural advantages of the local economies. And on the other side, after the jobs opportunities are created, what would happen? Very likely is that it will attract a lot of people, migrants from other locations, in pursuit of those job opportunities and higher wages. And without the catching up of the land market and the housing market, what would happen is that the housing price would rises accordingly because of the rising demand. And eventually, this would hurt, this would potentially hurt the local residents because right now they have to pay higher rents. And at the same time, for policymakers who care about like an even development or balanced development across base, promoting agglomeration economies for certain locations could also mean reducing agglomeration economies in other locations. So for overall like welfare improvement, would this place-based policies just reshuffling economic activities and not improving overall welfare? This is an empirical question. And we actually find mixed evidence on the effectiveness of such policies, of place-based policies in the US context. We have seen some really successful examples, including the most famous $1 million plans. So research find that the communities or the neighborhoods who get such plans actually have a great improvement in their firm's productivity in general. Other successful examples including empowerment zones and Tennessee Valley authorities. However, the literature also finds some less productive and less effective examples. This including the California's Enterprise Zones program. Um, Empirical research finds that even though this program is trying to promote a more balanced development for California and try to promote development, especially for underdeveloped areas, they find that this does not increase employment or shift employment towards lower wage workers. And another example is opportunity zones. Research finds that those kind of placement policies generates no private investment response, like there's no firms entries, and the only thing that happened is that the housing price for multifamily housing increased. So would Intel's entry be a big success? This is a question we're trying to answer and trying to probe in today's discussion. So I will break this down into 3 different questions. The first question is, would the most direct question is, after the government invest a lot in providing conditions for Intel's success, would other firms follow? Would this promote a virtuous cycle for business in the future? And the second, if firms do follow, would this create agglomeration forces that promote the local productivity in the long term? And lastly, who will benefit from such a policies, such a great investment in local economies? If not, we want to have some like ideas of how this benefits be divided between local residents or migrants, homeowners or renters, or how does this benefit divided among different skill groups and different sectors. So to answer the first question, would firms follow Intel? Would firms follow the big investment by the Ohio government? So to answer this question, the most basic question we have to think about is, how do firms choose locations? Ultimately, as we just mentioned, firms, the ultimate goals of firms' operations is to maximize profits. To maximize profits, they need, or for basic operations, they need suppliers, stable suppliers, and a large enough markets for them to sell their products. And if they don't have access locally, infrastructure would come into play, and actually a very vital play. If they don't have access to local markets and local suppliers, can they get access to those resources easily by convenient infrastructures? Besides that, is it possible for the firms to get cheap lands and labors? And for firms, just like Intel, they probably want a specific kind of labor, especially those labor who possess certain skills for productions, which means they probably want to be close to education institutions. And besides that, how easy for firms to get resources or grants from the government, which means policies and subsidies could play a very important role. So why in the first place do Intel choose Ohio? It turns out Ohio have a lot to offer. First of all, Ohio has in general, very friendly business climate. Ohio has a 0 state tax on corporate income. And besides that, the regulations for firms to do business is relatively loose in Ohio. Besides that, because we have many education institutions, Ohio State is among one of them. There's an easy access to skilled workforce locally. Besides that, Ohio has abundant cheap lands with a lot of water. This is extremely important for semiconductor industry, which is in general more land and water intensive. And because of the friendly business climate, Ohio has attracted a lot of industries over the years. This includes GM, Ford, and Honda. And those companies, those automobiles companies, are perfect downstream industries for Intel. And we also have the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which also can serve as an important downstream industry for Intel. Besides all of the concerning the urgent needs for climate change, Ohio is also one of the lowest hazard risk areas in the US, with really low occurrence of natural hazards such as tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes. So in the long term, Ohio does not only provide a lot of resources for business, it also provides this like risk-free environment if we consider the climate change. So it is perhaps this kind of like advantages provided by Ohio does not only apply to Intel, and so it is possible it would also attract other firms. So would this attraction of many firms create a big push to the economy? And can this big push be sustainable? So there are a lot of potentials. The first important potential for positive spillovers across these firms is that not only Intel is promoting a lot of stimulates a lot of investments in infrastructures, it also promotes a lot of investments in R&D. So there has been so this is a graph showing the Intel's semiconductor education and research program for Ohio. So Intel is promised to invest about $50 million for this program. And this would potentially promote a lot of technology innovation within the states that could potentially stimulate knowledge spillovers and promote sustainable growth in the future. Besides that, we already seen a lot of suppliers have decided to started moving into this New Albany International Business Park. This already shows the potential for Intel's promotions for positive spillovers. However, there's also concerns. Even though Ohio possesses a lot of advantages, including cheap lands and water, skilled labor force, it is also located in a place with less market access or proximity to major tech hubs. This might not be so important for some industries, but this market access and proximities to other tech hubs is important for semiconductor chips industry. So semiconductor chips requires a complicated process of production, testing, packaging, and according to these news articles, even for Intel, several of the steps of the productions will continue to occur in Asia. So this really complicated high-tech production procedures may need a lot of market access, but Ohio not yet have it. And this is specific to the semiconductor industry that would raise this concern of the sustainability of this big push brings about by Intel. And this is also reinforced by economic research. So a lot of positive spillovers, according to economic research, can be very localized, which means those kind of positive spillovers can happen at a really small spatial scales. And this is especially true for for high-tech industry, such as semiconductor industries, which involves a lot of knowledge spillovers. So the intuition behind this is that for this positive spillovers for cluster of firms to happen, it requires a lot of in-person communications between technicians, between skilled labor force. However, this might change after COVID because there's more and more usage and more widely use of Zoom, for example. However, there's also research showing that Zoom interactions is not a perfect substitute for in-person face-to-face interactions. So this is a demonstration from a paper that shows how employment clustered in downtown Manhattan. So even though Manhattan is like most advanced, most crowded districts in the world, we do see a lot of the industry actually just clustered in several selected blocks. And this is especially true for finance, which perhaps involves a lot of in-person interactions. Besides that, there's another idea from the economic literature that makes us concerned if the Intel entry is a big enough push to the local economies. So this is the idea called path dependence. So let me introduce you the story of this paper. So this is actually a very famous paper in economic literatures. So what this paper looks at is how does the historical portage sites in the US looks like today. So the upper graph here is the nightlight. So basically is that how economic activities looks like today. And this is the locations of the historical portage sites. So the historical portage sites in the US was very important for economic development back in the historical period of the settlement of North Americas, when most of the transportation back then of cargoes and goods depends on rivers, depends on water. And those locations actually are very important, what they call portage, because they are those locations when cargoes and people have to get off the boat and move from one waterway to another waterways. So those are the very important economic centers back then. However, as you probably know today, most of the transportation in US has transferred from water-based to more land-based or air-based. So those locations, in theory, has lost its natural advantages. And perhaps, depending on the current transportation networks, it is most likely not so efficient to promote more, invest more money on this location. However, as you can see from the upper graph, those locations, even though they nowadays they lost their relative natural advantages, they still remain the most productive places. They have this like really, they still remain the most important cluster of economic centers. So this actually shows the existence of path dependence. What does that mean? It means that there is this like lock-in effects in economic development. So certain location choices is locked in due to momentum, network effects, or established norms. So back in historical period, those locations get a lot of investment for infrastructures, for local business, for housing. And over time, even though they already lost their important natural advantage, that actually contributed to their initial development. But because it's so expensive to invest another road, to invest in another hospital in other locations, people might as well just keep investing in those locations. This creates this momentum that keeps resources flowing into these locations, even though they lost their advantages. So the stories actually tell us it is not easy to change the development path. It is not easy to alter the development path for certain locations. It probably needs more investment than people think to actually promote sustainable economic development for certain locations. So to sum up, would firms follow Intel? Would this Intel entry, combined with the large investment from the government, attracts more firms and promote long-term development of Ohio? We have a lot of rationals and advantages, and because Ohio offers numerous advantages, and this kind of advantages goes beyond only one firm, which is Intel. And besides that, the entry of Intel could potentially create a lot of agglomeration effects delivered by knowledge spillover, delivered by infrastructures, and eventually attracting more business. However, this kind of agglomeration benefits really varied based on spatial scale, especially for high-tech industry like semiconductors. Would this agglomeration effects big enough to promote the development? It's really an empirical question. And lastly, does Intel entry provide sufficient momentum for sustained long-term development? This would require consistent and continuous investment probably from the public sectors. So besides the firms, another important agents or contributors to local development is people. So would people move to Ohio? And if so, who would move? So to understand this question, the most basic question we can ask is, how do people make location choices? So in general, people make their location choices by choosing the desirable bundle of the following. So they want to have higher income, and this should be discounted by the cost of living, which is the price you have to pay for buying goods locally. And one of the largest cost of living people have to pay is housing. Besides that, people also would probably also care about local amenities. For example, is there good schools around? Can their children go to the school that actually provide the best education resources? And are there any like open spaces? Are there good state parks, city parks that they can enjoy their lives, and so on? So people's location choices can depend on many, many aspects. And besides all these local factors that would affect people's location choices, if people are born in a certain location and they want to move to another location, they have to pay migration cost. This migration cost could be, the transportation cost you have to pay by physically moving from one location to another. It could be the psychic cost you have to pay to leave your friends and your social networks around the neighborhood of your hometown. So migration costs can have important implications for people's location choices too. So let me first introduce how population has changed in Ohio over the last decade. So actually, Ohio's population only grew by 1.3% from 2010 to 2018. And this is not a very high number compared to the aggregate number of the US, which is 6.3%. So a lot of these like low population growth rate is depending on is determined by the age structure of the population. And another aspect, another mechanism behind this is we actually have a negative net migration, which means there are more people moving out of Ohio than the people who actually migrate in Ohio. So the first of all, why what explains the low population growth of Ohio? The first one is actually Ohio has a pretty what the demographer would call constrictive pyramid population structures. So this is a graph showing the age structure of of the population in Ohio by gender. And as we can see, even though we have a decent amount of like younger people, most of the population actually concentrated in this mid-age and elderly age range. So this implication for this is that we probably don't have a lot of people that can work if there's more labor demand, if there's more firms enter the states. So this kind of like population structures implies that if there's more opportunities, for example, if there's more firms entry following Intel, a lot of these needs has to be filled by migration. However, as we just talked about, we actually have a negative migration net migration rates of Ohio. We actually lose populations instead of gaining populations in net. So where does these migrants coming from for Ohio? So this is a breakdown. Table 2 is a breakdown of the composition in terms of geographic areas of the sending to states and receiving from states of Ohio. So most of the out migrants of Ohio goes to Florida, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Indiana. So both basically a lot of people migrate to the surrounding or nearby states, perhaps for better amenities or perhaps for better job opportunities. Besides that, Ohio get a lot of migrations from internationally. So actually there are more than 16,000 permanent residents from other countries coming into Ohio in 2019. So most of the immigrants are coming from Asia, which construct about 44% of the total immigration pools. And the most common sending countries were India and the Philippines. So even though we in Ohio we have a negative net migration, we do get immigrants from the surrounding states and internationally. Another thing we have to think about is that even though we get migrants from internationally or domestically, what are the constructions looks like? What are the structure of those migrants? Because the Intel or the suppliers firms really requires a lot of skills, so which makes the college educated young adults extremely important for meeting the needs of those companies. So are we actually losing college educated young adults? So actually this does not seem the case. So if we look at the breakdown of the education attainments status of those young adults, and we also look at the out migrants and the in migrants, we lose about 57 like 57% of the out migrants actually belongs to the college educated, or what we often refer to high skill group. But this seems to be compensated by the in-migrants. Besides that, if we look at the migration of the college freshmen from 2004 to 2020, we actually see some positive signs, the reverse of this brain drain. The vast majority of Ohio high school seniors actually attend college in the States. And the number of college immigrants have nearly doubled between 2004 and 2020. And actually, since 2010, the number of college immigrants have outpassed the number of college out migrants. So in total, we're actually gaining college educated young adults, which is a good sign for a more skilled labor pool. And besides that, the migrations trends is not consistent over space. We see totally different diverging trends for different districts, for different county within the states. So this is a map showing the migration changes from 2010 to 2019 for the whole state, breakdown by counties. So we do see most counties within the state, actually 68 out of 88, experience negative net migrations during this period, which is consistent with the general aggregate trend of the whole state. We do see a lot of actually the Central Ohio, especially the Central Ohio districts, we're actually gaining migrations. Actually, Franklin, Delaware, and Warren, which is close to Cincinnati, experienced the greatest gain of migrations. So even though we see a negative aggregate trend for migrations for the state, we do see cluster of migration flows, especially to Central Ohio, where the Intel is gonna located in. And this is reinforced and correspond to the amenities which people care in their location choices in Central Ohio. So this is a spatial distribution of the current amenities in Central Ohio. So we have more schools, more commercial facilities, and medical facilities in Central Ohio, in Columbus areas, basically, especially Franklin County and Delaware County. And if we look at the proposed development by 2019, most of the investments for improving amenities, which people care, is going to be clustered again in Franklin County, Delaware, and also we can see some investment in Albany, where Intel is going to locate in. So this is this like positive migration flows would perhaps be reinforced by these amenities investment by the government, by private sectors and public sectors. Besides that, the Intel itself would perhaps create more amenities to attract more migrants in Central Ohio. So this is a picture showing the Chandler in Arizona, which is an earlier powerhouse that Intel chosen for its like major facilities. So since 1980s, Chandler today has almost 300,000 residents, and it has enjoyed about a tenfold increase in its population since 1980s. So this is people move there, probably not because there's more job opportunities, but also because there's more clean, organized streets, there's more nice apartment, there's more nice offices. So though Chandler, the locations is not only not too bad place to work, but also not too bad place to live. So what we learned from this is that the Intel investment is probably not only providing job opportunities for people, it could also provide better amenities for people. So this Intel entry would perhaps drive more migrants into Central Ohio. However, another big aspect of people's location choices is that people move to locations, but they also have to pay a higher cost because they need housing. So how does housing market looks like in Ohio? So this is some trends and maps showing the monthly median home sales price in Ohio. So in general, from 2009, we see a pretty coincide trends, pretty steadily increasing trends of housing sales price for both Ohio and the national. And most of the housing price increase also happens in Central Ohio, where the locations happen to have more demand. There's more migrants, there's more population growth. So the median home price has risen since 2011, and by the end of 2018, it was more than twice the median household income. So what this means is that over time, home ownership is more and more affordable for residents in Ohio and for migrants who are willing to move into Ohio, especially those hotspots in Central Ohio. So what contributes to the rising housing price? On one hand, there's more demand, as we just talked about. The business environment create more opportunities that attracts more migrants. But on the other hand, the housing units actually grows pretty slowly. The housing constructions is not catching up. Since 2010, Ohio only added around 89,000 housing units of a net increase of 1.8%. This really falls behind the population and migrant growth. And another aspect of housing stock of Ohio is that a lot of housing stock in Ohio is relatively old. About half of the Ohio housing units were built actually before 1965. So it is really important not only for new constructions, but also for maintaining high quality housing to accommodate the increasing need for people to move or to move into Ohio. And this could be this rising needs is not sufficiently met by the supply of housing can be shown in the quarterly vacancy rates. So as time goes by, we can see there's a lower rates and consistently lower rates of vacancy rates, both for Ohio and the US. And at around 2017, both the homeowner and rental vacancy rates achieve its lowest point. What this implies that there is a very tight housing market where there's a lot of demand and not so much supplies. So to sum up, what we have seen is that even though we see a net migration rates for Ohio, this is not evenly distributed over space within Ohio. We do see a lot of demand for the young, high-skill workers, and we do see a lot of demand in the mostly in certain locations, such as Central Ohio, which is attracting a lot of business too. So we will see potentially, as Intel and many other suppliers and firms move in, there will be a rising demand over time. And more and more migrants would move into Ohio, and especially Central Ohio. And the benefits of the Intel projects and the supporting, government grants would be expected to be shared by both Ohio's residents right now and the newcomers, basically the migrants. And these opportunities may not be equally available to everyone. So there is a current research by a few economists. Actually, they collect the data of all the high skill, most of the high skill firm entry in the US, and they find that the high skill firm entry, just like Intel, actually is more beneficial to high skill workers than low skill workers. Besides that, as this kind of firm entry attracts a lot of migrants into certain locations, this actually put a lot of pressure on housing markets. And housing prices rises a lot, which increase the capital gains for homeowners, but hurt renters. So in general, high-skilled homeowners are those people, those population who gains the most. Echoing their research, what we see in Ohio is that we see increasing trend for housing demand. However, we don't see the housing supply catching up that fastly, that sufficiently. So this would potentially have implications for who's gonna get the benefits, and perhaps this would negatively impact renters and some vulnerable households. And another aspect of this that I didn't have a chance to actually talk about is that what are the potential impacts of the Intel entry on other sectors? For example, agricultural, especially for such a big agricultural state like Ohio. What are the impacts? On one hand, Intel and the whole stimulus brought about by Intel would increase demand and expanding the market by promoting higher income and attracts more migrants. This would perhaps have a positive impact on agriculture, and this sharing infrastructure and knowledge spillovers could perhaps provide agglomeration forces between sectors. For example, it would provide more resources for agricultural development too, by providing more technology innovations. However, on the other hand, a lot of resources are limited. For example, land, water, and also labor. Would this Intel entry put more competitions and put more pressure on these limited resources and actually hurt agriculture? We need more data and more evidence on this. So besides, we have to talk about the firm size and the potential population or population size response to this Intel entry. But there are also other caveats that I don't have today. We don't have time to cover. So the first one is the time dimensions. As a lot of you have already known, the constructions of the Intel sites is again postponed. And in general, this kind of large firm construction size takes a lot of time. It could take more than 10 years to actually have everything ready to actually operate. So we really need to take this time dimension in mind, that it probably would take time for this place-based policy to actually take into effect. And the second, one of the reasons why Intel chose Ohio is the strategic purposes of reducing natural disaster risks in the coastal area, and there's a concern for protecting national security. So when we evaluate such policies, we also need to take this dimension into considerations. For example, there's a lot of economic research right now trying to look at the effects of place-based policy, actually construct economic model dynamically. So basically, they consider that over time, the natural disaster risk could evolve, and this would affect our evaluation for certain policies. Besides that, besides like development implications of such policies, this kind of policy could have important environmental implications. For example, how does that affect the water and energy in Ohio? Actually, the Center of Urban and Regional Analysis at OSU has done a really fantastic panel discussion about this aspect. So I have attached the YouTube link here. So if you guys are interested, this would be a really nice resources to check. Besides that, more general questions of about this like place-based policies is that public spendings are also limited. So potentially these resources right now we have good into this supporting Intel can be potentially spent on other areas. For example, promoting education facilities, promoting health facilities. Would this investment in Intel really worth it? Is this the most effective way to use this kind of resources? We need a more comprehensive and deeper cost-benefit analysis that could involve researchers and policymakers from different fields. Besides that, so in sum, so today we have talked about the potential firm and population response to this really large, ambitious efforts of Ohio, especially featured by this Intel entry. So this kind of policies have attracted a lot of attention globally and especially in US. This kind of policy can be very, very effective in promoting agglomerations and promoting long-term opportunities. But at the same time, there's a lot of nuances of like promoting of designing these policies more effectively. And I think it would really need a lot of more discussion and more communications between researchers from different fields and policymakers to better design the policies. So this is, I think I'm running out of time. A lot of time, sorry. So thank you so much. So I'm happy for more discussion and Q&As, but I think we are running out of time. But if you have any follow-up questions, please send an email to my OSU account.
Well, thanks very much, Yao, for a really interesting webinar. And I learned a lot more about the Intel, or the implications of Intel coming here to New Albany than I certainly have read in the local media. Before people go, if you could fill out the Qualtrics survey for us, that would be really helpful. In terms of questions, Yao, I have a couple of questions. My first question is, I did, with one of my former graduate students and Alan Kleibrett, we did some work on the effect of Taiwanese science parks. And in our research, we found that the selection effects were actually much more important than the agglomeration effects. And for those who are listening, the selection effects are where you have heterogeneous firms and only the most productive firms relocate to, say, New Albany. And the actual long-term effect is to drive out lower productivity firms from that region. And so you don't get the agglomeration effects that you were suggesting. So I guess my first question would be, what are your thoughts on that possibility as opposed to the sort of traditional Marshallian agglomeration economies that you've talked about that I know sort of dominate regional economics thinking? And my second question, it sort of relates to your last point about, is this a good way of spending money? What's the cost-benefit analysis? I'm an international economist, and from everything I read, the United States is not the only country that's doing this sort of space policy right now. In fact, economists like Danny Roderick at Harvard talk about we've suddenly gone back to industrial policy that we thought, we'd sort of dropped industrial policy 20, 30 years ago. So I guess my question would be, ultimately, don't you think this is just a prisoner's dilemma, that the US has to invest federal dollars in subsidies, the EU invests federal dollars in subsidies to support these kinds of industries, but it all ends up being a zero-sum game, irrespective of whether the WTO would find these things to be illegal subsidies? So I'm going to throw those two questions out there at you. I'll wait to see if there are any more questions in the Q&A. I know that Brent has a question as well. So what do you think?
So Ian, should I address those questions first?
Why don't you carry on addressing my questions, and then we'll come back to Brent's question as we still have a few minutes.
Thank you so much. So Ian, those are really, really important and really interesting questions. So let me address the second one. Share my thoughts on that. I don't know I can address it. So that's definitely true. This kind of place-based policy is widely used, not only in the US context. And as I just talked about, even in the US context, we have mixed evidence on how effective they are. So this kind of policies, one big features of those is that they're not targeting certain firms and certain populations. And this could create problems. First of all, because people and firms can move. So sometimes you would miss the target, right? Even though they're targeting, for example, the Ohio government is trying to promote welfare of the local firms and local jobs, local households, welfares. However, because people can move out of states and kind of driving, enjoy the benefits and driving the housing price up, this could drive those local residents out. And actually, these benefits goes to some other targets instead of the original targets. And the second concern, as you just talked about, actually, if we just provide benefits to a certain locations, or we just reshuffling economic activities from one place to another, and in total, there's no benefits. It's just a waste of money, right? Because those projects are usually very expensive, as we can see in the Ohio case, right? So, which makes the justification for such policy extremely important. First of all, we have to learn the mobility of people and firms of a certain context. Who is gonna be able to enjoy those benefits? So this should be considered by policymakers in evaluating or predicting the potential effects. And the second is agglomeration effects is very, very important for justifying such policies. If we really want to spend money on a certain location, we have to make sure clustering firms and jobs in certain locations can promote this virtuous cycle. Even though the subsidies has removed, the development can continue. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So another question is about the selection effects. So definitely true. Those more productive firms, Ian, you're a trade economist, so you probably know better than me the Malese model. The most productive firms would stay, and the drives out the less productive firms, right? This is definitely true. And this provides another aspect that policymakers really need to think about. Promoting helping one certain industry could potentially hurt another industry or sectors, right? So, which means the careful analysis of the market structure of a location really important.
Yeah, as a trade economist, of course, I know the Melitz model. I've had several students work using that model, and I know it's been applied in the regional economics literature. So I don't see any more questions in the chat box, but Brent asked a very interesting question, which is a bit broader than, than maybe you may have thought about. He says, do we know how much of an impact tax policy and amenities like climate, weather, the outdoor resources have on migration patterns? So he's asking, do state tax policies affect migration, and does local climate, local weather, local outdoor, I guess, resource amenities, how does that affect migration? What do we know about that? So beyond
That's
the
a,
sort of industrial park like arguments you've been making.
yes, that's a really great question. Actually, this is a kind of like a hot topic. A lot of researchers beyond the economics are trying to understand how does like like local public finance and basically understand what determines people's like migration patterns, right? So there's a lot of research already being done. Actually, use very complicated structural model to try to understand how this different elements contribute to people's location choices, including a few papers that I'm happy to talk more about that actually quantify the welfare loss created by the current tax policy in the US. So there's definitely a better way to optimize the tax policies currently tax policy to promote overall welfare in the US. So the other side of this is that the implication of this is that tax policy do have a lot of implications for migration patterns in the US, and it can affect overall welfare. And besides that, I'm happy to do that if I have the data. A lot of economists actually run this migration equations, regressions, trying to understand how different factors, which one is the most important one to determine people's location choices. I think it will be a really nice piece of information we can learn in Ohio, right?
Well, we have one last question, which I really think is a very interesting question. This is from Alan Lines, who's one of our former colleagues in the department. Alan's a great supporter of these webinars, and so I think it's only right that I ask his question, even though we're well over time. So Alan asks, how do you account for the seller of these projects perhaps overstating the benefits and the opposite being true for local planners? So I think the question is getting at, is there some sense that to use an English expression, the pudding is, there's an over egging of the pudding going on. The planners are making claims, but the planners of the projects are making claims that maybe are an overstatement of the benefits.
Yeah, that's there's this like a moral hazard, right? Yeah, so honestly, I don't know, like I hope those numbers the plans are proposing are true, and even this is an understate, but honestly, there is a chance, there's a possibility this could be like overestimates. And I think the plans have the incentives, may have the incentives to do it. However, when we talk about like how much job opportunities are created, not only the supply, which is from the plan side, is important, but also it's like, do people in the locations can actually grab those opportunities? Do we have enough labor pool? Do we have enough labor supply locally to actually grab those opportunities? So the other side of this, like the other side of this problem, the question is that we have to think about how to improve our labor markets to actually utilize those job opportunities, no matter how much they claim it's going to be, to the best. And I think this is like there's definitely the chance of moral hazard, but what we can do is like to maybe like smooth the labor market and utilize those job opportunities brought about by this program better.
Okay, well, I don't see any more direct questions for you, Yao, in the Q&A box. But somebody did ask earlier if the slides would be available, and I can let everybody know that the slides will be available on our website after the webinar. And I'm sure if anybody would like to get hold of the slides directly, that they can email Yao here in the department. So Once again, I'd like to thank Yao for a really interesting seminar, very interesting and obviously very topical for us living here in Central Ohio. And I'd like to thank everybody who attended the webinar today. We appreciate your engagement with us, and we hope to see you back again. And for those of you that maybe are interested, next month's webinar, which will be on April the 17th, the same time, 12 p.m., is going to be again by a faculty member. This time, this will be Dr. Mark Partridge, and he's going to be giving a seminar, a webinar on do renewable energy needs ask too much of rural Americans? That will be our next webinar next month. So with that, I'm going to bring the webinar to an end. And again, once again, thank everybody for attending. So
Thank
take
you.
care. Have a good day.
Thank you.